When Resident Evil 4 released in January 2005, it saved a dying series from itself. After nearly a decade of trotting out the same old conventions again and again, the man behind the franchise, Shinji Mikami, upended all the cliches and came out with a masterpiece. But of the many things he changed, one was the switch from shuffling zombies to possessed people. While that worked great for RE4, it left publisher Capcom without their iconic monster. And at the same time, the 7th generation of consoles had released with enough horsepower to allow for dozens of AI characters on screen at once. So as they set to work on the follow-up to Mikami's game, they put another team to work on a brand new series that would take the zombie back to its roots, browsing for brains.
Clean up! Register 6!
In July 2005, only a few months after Resident Evil 4 dropped, Capcom announced Resident Evil 5. They had a trailer to show off and a couple of news bombs. For one thing, horror would be coming to the new kids on the block, the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. For another, the trailer showcased broad daylight in a series famous for its spooky atmosphere. Also of note was that Mikami would not be involved with this title. Rather, this game would be under the leadership of producer Jun Takeuchi. What wasn't announced was a release date. While fans were hoping for a quick turnaround, this was Resident Evil, which had a history of long development cycles. And RE5 would be no different. 2006 came and went with no more evil. But it did give fans something. Taking horror back to the foundations that George Romero laid in the 70s, Capcom unleashed Dead Rising for the Xbox 360 in 2006. It featured a shopping mall, you, and zombies.
Zombies, huh?
Lots of zombies. Despite a trend in the 2000s to show zombies as fast and agile, these endless hordes would be as slow and mindless as, well, zombies. The key selling point was that the player's character could slaughter zombies in whatever way he could imagine. Every object and every item in the game could be picked up and weaponized. For that matter, pretty much anything could be worn by the player too. The result, while incredibly gory, leaned more towards comedy than anything else. That being said, it did have one mechanic that ramped up the difficulty curve. The entire game had a countdown timer. On top of that, the missions were time sensitive, which meant that if you weren't at the right place at the right time, you lost the game. It was an innovative challenge to be sure, but it was made more a fault by the fact that players were only allowed one save. This meant that if a gamer saved a game at a place that made it impossible to reach the next mission in time, he'd have to start the entire game over. Most of these issues were later fixed in the February 2009 port for the Wii called Chop Till You Drop. It not only allowed the player multiple saves, but also made each mission have its own timer as opposed to one overarching timer for the entire game. Despite these genuine improvements, it had one fatal flaw. The Wii's weaker system specs meant that there weren't that many zombies on screen at once, which was the entire point of playing the game. In early 2007, disaster struck. Capcom had set up a new department in 2004 called Clover Studio, in which they had gathered some of their best talent, including Shinji Mikami and Devil May Cry creator Hideki Kamiya. But in late 2006, Capcom had determined that this new studio wasn't profitable and shut it down. They had expected everyone to come back to other internal Capcom branches, but instead, the Clover crew decided to leave and form their own new startup, first called Seeds and later Platinum Games. Capcom had lost Mikami, the man who had not only invented Resident Evil, but had always managed to breathe fresh air into the series whenever it got stale. But the publisher wasn't about to stop making Resident Evil 5. And sure enough, the game surfaced again at E3 2007. Importantly, the new trailer was shown at Microsoft's press conference. Since the franchise had before only come to Nintendo and Sony, this was a big win for the Big M. At the conference, the producer Jun Takeuchi promised a 2008 release. But having learned from previous experience, most people thought the date might get pushed. And they were right. Resident Evil 5 released in March 2009 for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, nearly 4 years after its original announcement. And when people sat down to play it, they were in for a bit of a surprise. Taking the RE4 approach to its logical extreme, RE5 had such an action focus that many critics stated it really wasn't survival horror anymore. The slow-paced, creeping dread had largely been replaced by constant combat. And so intense was that combat that only by having a second player could you make it through. As such, this game was designed from the ground up for co-op. If a gamer wanted to play single player, the second character would be taken over by the AI. With such intense changes to the tone and style of the game, would audiences still flock to the old cash cow? Or would it drive them away? 5.4 million copies later, the answer was that yes, they would still like to play. It stands as one of the most successful single titles Capcom has ever released. To date, the entire franchise has sold 44 million copies, making it one of the largest in gaming history and the high point of Capcom's catalog. It came as a surprise to absolutely no one when Capcom announced that Resident Evil 6 was in the works. No release date has been given. In the meantime, Capcom came to a Western studio and asked them to rise the dead again. Dead Rising 2 for the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PC released in September 2010 from Blue Castle Games. Despite the change in developer, the game was largely similar to the first, except that it was in a casino instead of a shopping mall. It also decided that the first game wasn't ridiculous enough, so they let players combine multiple items into even more implausible weapons. Amazingly, the game was a success before it even released. In August, Capcom released a downloadable game called Case Zero, which acted as both a prologue and a demo to the main game. At the low price of only $5, Capcom stated it had the best Week 1 sales of any Xbox Live Arcade game in history. A second DLC called Case West is under development now. All in all, it made Dead Rising 2 a massive success. So massive that in the same month, Capcom announced that it was going to acquire Blue Castle outright and rebrand it Capcom Game Studios Vancouver. Expect more zombies shuffling to a console near you soon. Capcom is a mighty name in the world of gaming, with several franchises that are legendary in the industry. And yet their most successful genre is the one that makes players feel at their weakest, their most helpless, and their most terrified. The little-used horror genre was brought into the mainstream by the publisher's single most successful franchise, and has been supported across the years by other series and spin-off titles. But without the guiding vision of the man who started it all in the first place, Capcom will now have to fill the void left by the titan of the genre. It's a scary time for Capcom, but then again, that's the entire point.